good morning, good afternoon, and good evening around the spinning, troubled, tortured world of ours, where today we're going back to what is potentially the biggest, most dangerous flashpoint in the world, the growing tensions across Europe and America and Russia and Eurasia over the Ukraine war and the endless consequences that continue to flow from it. The Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, a veteran in the position over the past quarter of a century, has just given a very somber, serious, and not at all threatening or demagogic, but extremely powerful speech, spelling out the nature of the deadlock between East and West on Ukraine and how every effort to negotiate an end to this terrible war that has killed up to 2 million people over the past 3 years and more has been blocked by the major Western European nations and by the successive US governments. What is going on? Is there a way out of this mess? Probably not. But we do have a very fine guide, an outstanding guide here. Michael Averko and I have never, I believe, met face to face in person. We haven't somehow had the chance to. We talk about it over the years, but for at least 15 years, correct me if I'm wrong, it may even be more, we have talked with each other, corresponded, and supported each other in our efforts to expose the truth as it can be found and set the record straight amid forests and mountains of lies on all sides, on the causes of East-West tensions and the terrible dangers they may lead to. I know of a figure of no greater integrity, no greater intellect, no greater experience and wisdom on these terrible issues than Mike Averko. Mike, it's a pleasure and a privilege to have you on the show. And tell me, in terms of the war with Ukraine, is there any hope of negotiations right now? Are things going to stay as they are, or are we on the edge of even greater precipice?
Well, I have to think, guys and audience, that this is going to go on through this year for sure. I also get the impression, partly they're putting on a brave face, but maybe they actually believe it because these elites are not the ones that are actually suffering. That the Kiev regime and its main backers in the collective West feel, and this is kind of bizarre, but I'm trying to put myself in their position so I can understand in totality what's at stake here. They think they can do a rope-a-dope. Now, hear me out. They are taking a severe pounding. You guys are of age to remember the Muhammad Ali George Foreman fight,
Oh,
where
yeah.
Ali went into that contest with a long game approach. That I'm going to have to take a pounding. This guy is younger and stronger. I'm going to dance all over the place. So stamina wise, he's going to get tired that way. Another way he would get tired is by, pounding Ali. But because Ali anticipated that, he expected this fellow to eventually peter out. I'm under the impression that the Kiev regime and their main backers actually think they can pull this off in their favor. And they're
Wow.
not. It's ridiculous because, look, Russia is not the side that has to use press gangs, okay, to try to get people to serve. Russia doesn't have people who are running away from serving. I understand that they're actually turning down some people. And then when I'm told in response, well, that's because Russia is offering perks to join the military. Oh, so in other words, the Russian economy is not doing so bad, is it? So unfortunately, there's a certain mindset in the West. It's going to really take a severe drubbing to eventually see things change. I mean, look at World War II. I mean, there were ardent Nazis who were willing to fight to the bitter end. So unfortunately, we're going to be fighting through this year. And another problem, too, that's going to prolong this situation is the reality of modern day warfare. You know, I know there are people in Russia who are increasingly frustrated, but they have to recognize that something like a mass blitzkrieg, a D Day like operation, you can't really do that anymore because you have modern day aerial reconnaissance that makes that kind of action more difficult. You know, you can't fake out your opponent like you used to. And then with weapons like drones, throwing hypersonic missiles, it leads to a change in how large above water vessels and land tanks can be used. Now, I'd like to think this sort of modernity to warfare can actually serve eventually as a detriment, but that hope is hindered by, I think, a realization that there will always be attempts to come up with something different to make the case that a given armed conflict can be successful. So I have to be a pessimist in that regard concerning this NATO proxy war against Russia with the Kiev regime as a pawn.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I'm a scholar of World War One, and part of the reason why everyone was eager to pile in was that everyone thought that it favored the offense. So the French had this strategy of à l'outrance or whatever, and they marched with their red trousers and their blue tunics into Germany in early August, and they were massacred. The most deadly month in the entire war was for France in 1914 August. It's because they didn't realize the extent to which, and they thought that good spirits would win the war. But in fact, of course, it was the defensive war par excellence with barbed wire and machine guns. And barbed wire and machine guns of today are drone warfare, which make it impossible to amass for large offensives. But of course, it also means that Ukraine's never, if anyone thought they're so before, they're simply not going to, if the Russians can't win or slowing down, the Ukrainians are definitely not going to win, right? So, I mean, even the West must realize that. And isn't that why they're trying for this, economic warfare? I mean, isn't one of the more plausible theories what Trump is trying to do is he's trying to, well, one thing is to shore up the dollar, but his energy warfare, seizing maybe Greenland and making friends with Alberta, seizing Venezuelan oil and then cutting off the Hormuz. Isn't that a way to also cut off the Chinese and Russian Iranian energy corridor? So, and then they're bombing the Russian refineries with Ukrainian drones flying through Scandinavia. I mean, it's insane. But basically, they're trying to defeat Russia economically, and apparently a Russian central bank governor, she's saying, well, they're heading for -2% growth this year. So, I mean, we had John Helmer was very pessimistic yesterday when we had him on. Are you as pessimistic? I think you said in an email before that you are more optimistic. What do you think? What do you agree with that? That's what the West's strategy is, and will Russia be able to weather it?
Well, gentlemen, I listened with great interest to what John said yesterday. When it comes to the YouTube talking head regulars on Russia, show me someone more proficient than John Helmer on Russian business and economic matters. That looks like his number one focus. So I am not dissing myself when I say I am not in a good position to second guess his business economic points, which happen to be shared by others in terms of what you mentioned about Russian economic prospects for the coming year. He comes across as the umpire sincerely calling balls and strikes over creative, wishful thinking spin. So I take what he says very respectfully, very seriously. But I also believe everything is relative. The key thing to look for, and correct me if I'm wrong, this was not touched on. How is Russia's ability to produce in volume and export in volume with income earned its fossil fuel? Has it really taken a dramatic hit at this point? Yes, Russia is taking hits. But getting back to this rope-a-dope concept, it is Russia which is much better enabled to take the hits than the Kiev regime and
Yes,
its collective West allies. The Kiev
I
regime has
agree.
no economy on its own. And we know that the E3, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, are not doing well at all socioeconomically and as well as in terms of military. I mean, it's kind of pathetic when we hear the E3 saying, oh, we will put boots on the ground provided there's an American backup and there's a ceasefire. In other words, you're admitting you can't really fight the fight. I mean, let's be frank about that. And the US has other pressing concerns, in part due to some of the frankly idiotic decision making. Take a case in point being this war against Iran. So I think that the game plan in Russia is that they are nevertheless still better equipped to play the long game than their adversaries. And so they are going to stay the course. Now, I do want to say something about what John mentioned about this Tuatsi refinery being hit multiple times. I have heard from multiple sources that that particular area of Tuatsi includes non-Russian fossil fuel that I gather involves Kazakhstan and or Azerbaijan. So maybe Russia thought that aspect would essentially shield Tuatsi from attack. I do recall Kazakhstan, in one instance at least, speaking negatively on an earlier Kiev regime strike that affected Kazakh commerce. Russia's a big place. It can't defend everything, but also Russia is a big and strong place that can withstand these instances, regardless of whether they are pinpricks or something more major. Following up also, too, on something that was mentioned with John, these upcoming elections, I think, are scheduled for September in Russia. We could look for the Kiev regime to and its ally to try to create chaos by doing some sort of 9/11 like or October 7th, 23 with regard to Israel action with the idea that it's somehow going to destabilize Russia. But as we know from past instances, including the Allied bombing of Dresden, that it only serves to further unite the population with the government. You could see that
Correct.
with Iran as well. So that's not going to work. And regardless, let's say there's a noticeable shift in the Russian Duma. Well, the replacements are not people who are going to be or who are going to lead to the likes of Navalny's wife or Khodorkovsky, Pussy Riot, and whatnot. There's still a lot of wishful thinking, unfortunately, in the West.
Mm. Well, I didn't have a chance to ask him actually. I mean, does the Parliament, does the Duma have any right to initiate legislation? I mean, can they put, just like America's a tripartite system where the Congress can stymie Trump's executive power? Could they actually do something like that in Russia?
It's structured on a strong presidency. My civics right now are lacking on that, to be honest.
Mm.
But there's nevertheless such unity. I mean, what do you think? Like, let's say if the communists take over,
Mm.
they're going to have a more agreeable to the West policy when it comes to
Mm.
Iran
Exactly.
and Ukraine. On economic matters, they're going to change. As John mentions, there's a lot of pushback to the oligarch influence as represented by Putin's economic person, Navalny, and this other fellow who
Dimitriev.
has,
Mm.
yes, Dmitriev. So, I mean, there'll be a change there, okay, let's say. But in terms of foreign policy, what the Westies primarily focus themselves on, you're not going to see a change that's more agreeable for them.
Mm. Martin?
I'm in full agreement with your assessment, Michael. And I'd like to explore something further that you brought up, which I think is hugely important. Like you, I have the highest possible regard and admiration for John. And John's assessment on purely internal Russian affairs is always of the greatest value and importance. But John was focusing on that. And you were taking a broader picture, I thought. You were comparing relative strengths and weaknesses in Russia with those in the West. And when I was younger, I was always too small and slight to be a sprinter. And I certainly wasn't skinny enough and didn't have the endurance to be a marathon man. And the only distance I was semi respectable at was the middle distance, 3,000 meters to 5,000 meters. And of course, you learn even at that relatively limited and controlled distance, you have to pace yourself. And it isn't just your own strength or weakness that you have in mind. You have to know the patterns and strengths and weaknesses of your competitors as well. Now, when you put Russia against the other European nations, as you have pointed out, but I would say against America too, Russia is in a much stronger position, I would maintain. And I very much appreciate your assessment on this, Michael. And that is people in the West have this fantasy, as you say, just one more little push and Russia will fall apart. Well, I mean, having sat at Pelle's feet, listening to his brilliant, genuinely outstanding assessments and reinterpretations of the patterns of World War One. You had throughout World War One these British and French fantasies, and then Ludendorff got them in 1917 and 18 himself. Just one more push and we'll win. We've lost millions of men, just throw away another 100,000 or 500,000 more lives, and then we'll have won. Then they'll break. And these were always catastrophic misassessments. We see Trump doing it towards Iran now. But it seems to me, if you look at the internal cohesion and strengths in Russia, Russia has a much stronger industry, much stronger economy than Britain or Germany or the United States does. They haven't deindustrialized the same way. They haven't bought the prophetess Greta Thunberg's green gospel of deindustrialization to the same insane degrees the Europeans and the Americans have brought them. Their advanced industry and technology is of a very high level. They do a lot more, not just with regular oil source and energy sources, but in terms of energy refining and oil refining capability than you find in Europe or still in the United States. Am I wrong on this? Or am I right on this?
No, you're right on this. And let me also emphasize, too, that in a number of respects, Russia has this, there's this wrong belief that Russia is this extremely corrupt place. Let's look at the corruption with the U.S. military industrial complex in terms of how much money is allotted to it. I mean, I've never seen these figures challenged. There's this Swedish, in Pelle's neighborhood, Swedish Military Institute that annually does these studies. And I think I got it right here that combined, the U.S. outspends Russia and China by a 3-to-1 margin. It outspends the next 7 leading states combined in defense expenditures. Now, the U.S. is the major military power overall, but clearly it also has its limits, and we see that in its inability to produce quality weapons in large numbers. I mean, Israel's having all sorts of problems. It's no secret now, because there's not enough of these defensive missiles, which, by the way, also have their limits when it comes to drones and ballistic/hypersonic missiles. In Russia, their military-industrial complex, there's a bit more of government influence. There's some privatization there, but it's not as corrupt. And the government and the military, they sit down together and they do legitimately strategize over what is the best military item to produce for Russia's security, as opposed to for-profit people who are concerned about how much money they can pocket first and foremost. And you also have the politicians. Lindsey Graham in part is a hawk because he's obviously getting money from this military industrial complex. And leading to that, not to digress too much, I've heard that one reason why Tulsi Gabbard remains in her position is because she's not that wealthy a person. Clearly, her congressional record is not indicative of someone who would attract large support from this military industrial complex. And so she has a sort of personal financial benefit to maintain her job in the administration. I mean,
Oh,
what is she going to do afterwards? Because
right. So she's not
clearly,
as
when
corrupt as the others.
yeah, but you know what? I noticed, if you notice, guys, when she was recently questioned, didn't she essentially say, hey, look, I said my opinion is that Iran is not this imminent threat. She didn't go against it, but then she said, the president is the boss, so, the boss's position prevails. Now,
Exactly.
okay, now people who backed Tulsi didn't like that. They felt, okay, so in other words, you're useless, you're being
Mm.
disrespected. Why don't you do the right thing like Joe Kent and resign? And so I guess maybe the reason why is premised on that point I mentioned. But on the other hand, too, in the hope of hopes, she's still being there. Maybe at some point Trump sees reason and she stays it out and somehow maybe makes a comeback. I mean,
Yeah.
look, within the past week and a half, I've heard some folks who very respectable when it comes to military intel. They believed over the past week and a half that the U.S. and Israel were going to re-escalate military conflict with Iran, but it didn't happen. And then we're hearing more recently reports that the top military brass essentially confronted Trump and said, listen, in reality terms, this is what we can and can't do. If you have us do this, this is what's going to happen. Now, is that what you want? Do you want to see casualties among our forces? Do you want to see prisoners taken? And so that is what perhaps has kept Trump from re escalating.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I mean, there's an article in Axios today. They've come out of nowhere and they seem to be very influential these days. And it's requoted by CNN saying Trump is going to meet his top brass today to discuss reigniting the war. Do you think that's going to happen? Given what you said, I mean, I take that on board. But
Yeah, he continues to be under a lot of pressure and influence of the Adelson, Mark Levin group and his war minister, whatever he's called, Pete Hegseth. He's not providing any pushback. He's all okay with this. And as per that New York Times article not too long ago, it was said, and it's reasonable to believe that Radcliffe and Rubio, who are not anti-Israel, and Vance, who you can't put into anti-Israel policy as well, they were not gung-ho on this attack. It's just that
Exactly.
because Trump is so volatile, they didn't really challenge, okay, his looking to do it at the instigation of Netanyahu and the top person at Mossad. I don't believe Trump has lost his marbles to a significant degree that he might not be rethinking. Hey, look,
Yes.
the Israelis said this would be so easy. Well, it's not. They were BSing me. They don't really care about the predicament here. They just want to see Iran wrecked. They're not necessarily interested in a regime change in Iran, Iran maintaining itself as a potentially strong entity. Even on good terms with the West, they're quite happy with a wrecked Iran that causes regional havoc, where Israel could be the kingfish, if you may. But that's not helping me here. And, he's a one term person, but I'm sure there are people in the Republican establishment, including Rubio and Vance, who have to look at 2028 and also this upcoming election. If this war continues, we have the gas price situation being what it is. And by the way, not just gas prices, but I mean, auto insurance premiums have gone above the roof as well. They could, you lose the House, you lose the
yeah.
Senate. They're going to be
So
cooked, and Vance can forget about becoming president in 2028. Vance, I think, could have taken a different approach on a number of issues and has really shot himself in the foot in terms of getting reelected in 2028. And the same goes for Rubio as well.
yeah. Well, Vance didn't impress me when he went to Islamabad, and Daddy Trump couldn't stop himself from dictating to him, and so he looked like an awkward teenage boy as he stepped off the plane. He's lost a lot of weight, and I thought
Yep.
this man does not look presidential, president in waiting at all. And a lot of us were
Mhm.
hoping that he might be a Trump, but better than Trump, as it were. But I don't know. I've lost a bit of faith. Sorry, Martin.
No. I just want to see into what you just said, Pelle, and to what you were saying, Mike. I fully agree with your assessment, Mike. I'm rather more hopeful in the long term about Vice President Vance. I've been seeing reports here, and that the vice president is actually planning to remove himself from the running in 2028. And because the pollsters around him and in the Republican Party, mainstream in general, believe that they're going to suffer an annihilating defeat because of gas prices and because of the whole Iran war fiasco in the November elections. And I think that's going to happen. And I still think Vance can be a figure of vast importance down the line in US politics and even in American history, but it would be rather like figures like Winston Churchill in Britain, his wilderness decade of the 1930s. Charles de Gaulle was in the political wilderness in France after saving it in World War II for more than a decade until he came triumphantly to power in 1958. I think Vance may be thinking in those terms that Trump has messed things up so catastrophically with the war with Iran that he won't be able to get off the hook on it. Now,
Yeah, that's
no, please go on, Mike. Yes.
okay. Sorry to interrupt. That's
No,
a valid
please.
point. But you know what? You're always taking a risk because let's say the Democrats get their act together.
Yes,
And
yes.
there are polls out now, and the establishment types, donor class, they have to recognize that Republicans and Democrats under the age of 40 do not think about foreign issues like Iran and
That is
Israel in the
correct.
same way. So there's a new way of thinking, and if you can get that influence among the Democratic hierarchy, and then you have a two-term Obama sort of scenario, well, then Vance becomes farther removed from another Republican term in this hypothetical instance. And it can happen because he's a young man, and we've seen older people, especially in the United States, become president. So, I mean, there's still hope, but, he's going to have to wait quite a bit.
Yes, I fully agree with you
So,
completely.
I mean, he'll only be in his early 50s if the
Yeah.
Democrats win for two terms. But Michael,
Yeah.
are you saying basically that if the your under 40s are very anti-Israel, whatever left or right, they're anti. They've got huge problems with incomes and buying housing and starting families, and then they're pretty anti. They're pretty isolationist, basically. The Democrats, if they tap into that, Vance will be out for the next two terms. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And then there's also another dynamic, too. It's interesting how in the American political landscape, they're always looking for some great bright light. Martin, you're based in the States. Do you remember this guy, Bobby Jindal in Louisiana?
Oh, in the dim distant past. Yes, go
Yeah, I
on.
mean, he was considered this up and coming guy. And more recently in Texas, Jasmine Crockett, she got voted out of office. And you could tell right away when she was being interviewed that she's not presidential material, but there was the hope that she could be a prettier version of Kamala Harris, Biden, et al. But, she basically shot herself in the foot. At one time, Cory Booker in New Jersey and Chris Christie, they were considered, potential presidential material. What always happens is they're going to be up and coming folks. And so Vance, has to concern himself with that going down the line, that he could easily end up being yesterday's flavor. Because if we're talking about a number of years from now, you're going to get a Republican younger than Vance with a consistent past who is going to be more impressive down the line. So what I'm saying is, a lot of times politically, you have to think more for the moment than in the ensuing years, because a lot can happen where you become yesterday's flavor.
I just want to say one thing. Sorry, I didn't understand.
Sure.
Do you say that Trump had figured out Netanyahu was lying to him, or he hasn't? What was your view? Yeah, I missed.
I was saying, well, I mean, definitely, if Trump actually believed this would be a cakewalk, yeah, I mean, he was given, BS, and he had readily accepted it. And the New York Times article seems to confirm that, yeah, it was the Israelis who were, in fact, gung ho, and his own entourage were not as much. And, he still has to deal with this element. Look, we're told that he speaks regularly over the phone with Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity, I understand, is the person who, propped Mark Levin. And, Trump, he's taken a noticeable tip in terms of what's influencing him to go from Tucker Carlson to Mark Levin.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, that he's betrayed everyone? But Martin, you want to go off in a different direction, perhaps?
Well, to go not so much a different direction as to follow up points that Mike was emphasizing just before, and I think it's an important one to explore this business about the Netanyahu-Trump relationship. Again, we don't know, we can't know, and Mike has made, I think, the key point, which is the volatility of Trump. Just when you think you have him figured and you're either despairing of him, or he appears to back off and do something sensible, or just when you think he's being very constructive in economic areas, he'll go off and start bombing Iran or make a fool of himself on this, that, and the other. You never know where you are with the President of the United States. But having said that, the most recent reports indicate that the Trump Netanyahu love fest, from the president's point of view, might be over. Now, maybe even if it is, Netanyahu will just re-hypnotize the president again, because he seems to be very good at that kind of thing. But there have been reports coming out from what appear to be reasonably well-sourced sources in the White House and around the president, and possibly even with the president's approval, saying that Trump feels betrayed and made a fool of by Netanyahu. There is this myth, which was always a myth, but it was almost universally believed in America by anti-Semites as much as by Zionists, that the Mossad is all wise, all powerful, all terrible. Nobody can stand in its direction. And yet here you have David Barnea, the head of the Mossad, a man who made his reputation by killing off lots of Iranian scientists and Iranian political leaders, and he's clearly very good at killing people. And that is a very useful trait to have in political leaderships anywhere. Look how far it got Winston Churchill, and most of all, look how far it got Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. It's very useful, unfortunately, but it is. But it's not everything, and it doesn't give sagacity, and it doesn't give wisdom. Absolute ruthlessness will win you the world if you are smart and shrewd as well. And Netanyahu and Barnea are not shrewd and smart. And what they have done now is, I believe, that they've exploded the myth of Mossad and Israeli genius and omnipotence. They told the President of the United States to his face, according to the New York Times reporting team. They told the president to his face, don't believe your own director of national intelligence. The CIA don't know what they're talking about. The entire US defense intelligence establishment, costing around $100 million, or is it billion? More likely $100 billion a year, doesn't know what it's talking about. Just listen to us. bomb Iran, and in 4 days they'll all fall apart and it'll all be over. And you'll be able to have cheap gas prices in the fall, and you'll still be able to say, I kept America out of a war by bombing Iran. And he and Barnea sold this to the president, and the president thought they were geniuses. And now he knows they're not geniuses. They have put Donald Trump in the biggest catastrophe of his two terms as president of the United States. This is not a neophyte president. This is the man who kept America out of wars for 4 years in his first term as president, who even restrained Netanyahu repeatedly during that period of time. And on this time, he listens to Netanyahu. He cuts loose against the most formidable enemy in the Middle East in modern history, a nation with a population of 93 million people on the brink of nuclear capabilities, that is a treaty ally of China and Russia, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. He listens to Netanyahu. He listens to Barnea. And every policy he has blows up in his face, and even MAGA, as you said, Mike, turns away from him and leaves him in the lurch. And Donald Trump is a volatile man. So if Netanyahu has managed to wreck his strategic relationship with Donald Trump, then there's hope for the world.
We've got to wind up there. Sorry, guys. Mike, okay. But I'll leave you with a final question. Putin and Trump had a phone call this week, and just after the King Chuck turned up in Washington and tried to get the Americans to sign up for World War III, you know, talking about the old special relationship, World War I, all that sentimental violin claptrap. But anyway, do you think that he had a phone call, and there's a very loud warning on TASS today saying that you know, terrible things could happen. Do you think that means that the Russians could intervene if the Americans go back and to reignite the conflict, or is it just what the Iranians have told the Russians that they'll do to, let's say, the vulnerable Gulf states? We just got a minute left, so just say what your thoughts are in a few sentences.
Sure. Well, the Russian read of that phone conversation is that Russia's supporting Iran in terms of not being attacked. They don't want to see Iran broken up. They also don't want to see a pro-Western puppet state in Iran. So, you know, it's not wise to do an escalatory strike. But then, you know, I heard a soundbite of Trump's matter on that call, and Trump said that they talked mostly about Ukraine, but the Russian read is different, and between the two, something tells me the Russian read is the more accurate one. And you'd like to think that not just Russia, but China as well are going to maybe somehow influence Trump to not re-escalate militarily, because forget about Chinese or Russian interests.
Being recorded.
Well, just to make a thing, I just wanted to talk about what's going on in a newsy item, which is, of course, King Charles's visit to America. And we're very interested in this topic because I'm from Britain and I'm in Europe, and we have a transatlantic show with Martin in America. So we like to cover these unions across the pond. What do you reckon, Michael? You were saying before the show that you thought it was a Zelensky performance, but just in posh received pronunciation English. What do you make of King Chuck's visit to Congress and Trump?
More anti-Russian Brit establishment mumbo-jumbo along the lines of what has been said from Keir Starmer, Boris Johnson, Ben Wallace, Sebastian Coe et al. And what was really chilling was when he spoke before the Congress in D.C. Charles was essentially a less obnoxious version of Zelensky's Oval Office stunt, only in this situation, he had the Washington groupthink mindlessly clapping for him, just like they did not too long ago, by the way, for Netanyahu. And Charles's rant reminds me of J.D. Vance's, since we were talking about him, Munich Security Council criticism of the EU and UK in needing to focus on its own problems, not demonizing Russia as well as China, and seeking better relations with China. And in anticipation that we would be covering this issue, I went down to my basement library. I have two books. I think one of them, one or both of you are familiar with. John Gleason's The Genesis of Russophobia in Great Britain, which originally came out in 1949. It was republished in 1972. And another one by K.W. Middleton, Britain and Russia, which came out roughly the same time in 1947. And I gotta wonder that what the scholarship has been like since these two books came out, because they seem to be the ones that are frequently referenced. I do recall Glenn Deason and Alexander Mercouris making mention of the Gleason book. And Gleason notes that this obsession with Russia in Britain began around 1815 when Napoleon gets defeated. Russia plays the lead role. Russian forces enter Paris. And rather interestingly, a number of the Russian officers, they got some Western ideas. These were not, political scientists. So they came back with the idea of, having a constitution to Russia. It didn't really go anywhere at that point in time. But 1815 seems to be a start date for this animosity towards Russia. It played a role in the Crimean War, and Britain essentially fighting a proxy war with Russia during the Russo-Japanese War, and also the ridiculous belief that Russia had designs on India, which it did not. Russia had plenty of its own landmass to develop. Russia also had a big power understanding, and they were readily accepting that India would be a kind of British sphere of influence.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that as I said, I did a lot of research on World War One, and when the British criticized Germany using almost the same language except Germany, there was a brief period when they befriended the Russians, and it was very difficult because they had to change this. Well, supertank is not the right word because they didn't have supertankers then. Supertank of Russophobia into Germanophobia and Russophilia. So it was about a 10-year window when Russia was all the rage, and they had to work really hard to turn away from the Russophobia and persuade the Russians. But there was a great talk with Ian Proud yesterday. He's got a podcast. He's like practically the only voice apart from Alexander Mercouris. Well, you said, how can he get away with it? But so they're two very good voices, and he had that former KGB spy, and they're talking about how much the Russians like England despite everything. They make their own Sherlock Holmes films and their own Winnie the Pooh films, and they love England, and it's just not reciprocated, and it's so sad. It's so, and the trouble is Scandinavia is even worse. Actually, I mean, I would say that I was at a school where Russian was like a trendy language to learn at A level, so quite a lot of people did learn Russian actually, and this was at the end of the Cold War. And there is actually a cultural elite in Britain that does like Russian culture, whereas in Scandinavia, if you studied Russian at your high school, you were a maniac. I mean, the Scandinavian feeling about Russia is almost racial, and I didn't feel it's that bad. It's not as visceral in the UK in that sense. There is some respect for UK culture, but among the British elite, Russophobia has no peer equal except possibly Poland, But it's yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Pelle.
No,
I have so much to say. I'm sorry.
That's why we need to have you back, Mike.
Okay. I mean, let's look, for example, in sports, okay? Because sports, okay, it's sports. People say it's not that important, but it's a good barometer of measuring how nation states think, okay? You have World Athletics, which is headed by this hypocritically bigoted Brit, Sebastian Coe. And he continues to support a blanket ban on Russian and Belarusian athletes. In other words, he doesn't even allow for them to compete or support them to compete in track and field as neutrals. He will only allow them to compete if they change their national allegiance, which has become more popular in sports. So in other words, it's like he's supporting a kind of genocide against the Russian identity when you think about it. And then, and this is how the success against Russia in sports, this bigoted discrimination, was allowed. The IOC, and I'm hopeful that Kirsty Coventry can eventually clean house like she has suggested in one way or another. The IOC has this Keir Starmer connected communication director, another Brit by the name of Mark Adams. When Russia protests against this blatant bigotry, that if it were done against Israel, Dershowitz would be going apeshit. Okay, this is clear bigotry, and it shows you the lack of Western ethics that there's not enough of an outrage towards it. And I'll also blast the Russian establishment as well, because yes, on the one hand, even when they talk about it, it's not going to be heard; it's going to be downplayed. That said, they could still be doing a lot more when it comes to soft power, communicating to a English language indoctrinated audience. The top Russian brass, they still have a ways to go. So when Russia protests this Mark Adams fellow I mentioned, he says Russia has reached a new low. On the other hand, when the Zelensky regime and their Banderite sports officials blast the IOC under the absurd charge that they're being too accommodating to Russia, Mark Adams doesn't say anything against that. Instead, you'll get people among these EU, UK influenced sports federations say things along the lines, well, it's an understandable protest. But when the Russians protest justifiably, it's labeled as something inflammatory.
Well, I can't. I mean, it's seldom talked about as a possible. Let's grant the opponents of Russia that Russia attacked Ukraine without sufficient. There wasn't a sufficient reason for it, but just the humiliation heaped on Russia, the arrogance, and the rudeness and the hatred and the ignorance just over these years. And I don't think the Russians themselves have talked about it. They talked about the Minsk agreements. They've talked about the Donbass killings and so on, but just the sheer humiliation. I mean, I've been on edge for the past 10 years because I've seen the insults coming from the British, and everyone inside Britain fails to see this. I'm a kind of insider outsider, and I said this is not going to end well, because I could see, as it were, Putin clenches his facial muscles at this, slowly building up resentment against the Brits, who think they run they run the world. They go to Brussels. I worked in Brussels, and the only ones who compete with them for arrogance are the French. So when the British, they are pretty bad, the French, but when the British and the French have a go at each other, it is projection. There is, and so they automatically take the chairmanship of any committee in Brussels, and everything's in English, of course, and then they make sarcastic jokes that the dumb Europeans laugh at, even when they're the butt of the jokes. So the Russians are, in a way, I mean, if the Russians are able to elevate their soft power in some way, there's a lot of buried resentment there that they could use against the Brits. Not least among the Ukrainians, when they realize they've been taken for a ride and used as a massive sort of what's the word, cannon fodder. And I think, sadly, I've emphasized this, but I've almost never seen it in print, which is that the Ukrainians were, as AJP Taylor said, they were the most minor of minor minorities, or the least active or intelligent or sophisticated minority in Eastern Europe during the Habsburg Empire. And for them to be elevated as freedom fighters and heroes, they could be let into the civilization of France and Britain and look down on their cousins, the Russians, as an entry ticket into that. I think a lot of them took it because they say, well, we look at, it's like this cultural civilizational gradient. You look down against the people living east of you to gain entry into the salons of the people living west of you. So by looking down on the Russians, that Ukrainians could enter into the British civilizational fold. And the British play that with everyone. They play it with the Swedes, they play it with the Finns, they play it with the Poles, they played it against the Germans before World War One. I mean, the Bosch, the Huns, the barbarians, never mind that the Germans were winning all the Nobel Prizes, they were still barbarians. So they played that game for hundreds of years, and they know it very well. And I'm amazed that people still suckers to it. And King Charles played it in his own subtle way. As I said, played the game much better than Zelensky, which had the Congress clapping like seals. But Michael, just a final question, because we really got to end there. Do you think it's going to have a practical effect? I mean, the Congress clapped. Trump got the message. He said we got to basically asking for the Americans to join Britain and stand shoulder and shoulder for democracy against those evil Russians, having stood together in the Cold Wars and in 2 world wars and in Afghanistan. Is it going to have a practical effect, or will the Americans, will the administration just brush it off?
I think more of the latter. Let agree to disagree. They'll put it aside. The U.S. with Iran, they have a full plate with that, and make no mistake about it, they're pressing socioeconomic matters here.
Right.
What motivates Americans en masse, and this is true in a number of other countries, is not so much foreign policy. In terms of this Russia bashing in Britain, it's really pathetic now because they're no longer a power. They have their own severe problems. It's a convenient diversion from reality.
Okay, yeah. And I was going to say, I mean, Trump had many opportunities to back what Charles was saying by saying, yes, Ukraine is the civil, we've got to stand for that. But instead, he just made a comment that, well, King Charles agrees with us on Iran privately. He didn't say anything. He talked to Putin and said, yeah, Putin wants peace. So basically, he buried that. I got very much the impression supporting what you're saying. But anyway, Martin and Michael, we've got to end there. And as I said, you must come on again soon because I feel that this conversation is far from over. Thank you so much, both of you. And see you tomorrow, Martin. Bye.
My
Bye.
pleasure.
Thank you, Mac.